Welcome to this explainer on a truly fascinating piece of history. You know, when we picture the conquest of Mexico, it's almost always the clash of steel, roaring cannons, and the relentless hunt for gold, right? Conquistadors and galleons. But today, we're flipping the script entirely. We're zeroing in on a figure whose absolute best weapons weren't made of iron, but of words. We're talking about La Malinche, the woman whose voice and sheer intelligence made the entire Spanish conquest possible.
Victim of fate or architect of destruction? It's a pretty profound thing to think about. Back in 1519, this young, teenage indigenous woman stood right between a tiny, vastly outnumbered fraction of Spanish soldiers and the absolute mightiest empire in the Americas. She didn't hold a sword, she didn't fire a single weapon, and yet, she brought an entire civilization to its knees. So, as we walk through this today, I want you to constantly ask yourself, was she just a tragic victim caught in the gears of history, or the ultimate, incredibly calculating architect of an empire's fall?
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the strategic gift.
To really get a grip on her impact, we actually have to start at a pretty dark place. Her story with the Spanish doesn't start with her holding any sort of royal status or negotiating power. It begins with her being treated as literal property. Even though she was born into a noble Nahua family, in a stunning betrayal by her own people, she was sold into slavery. To the Mayans. Fast forward to 1519, after a battle in Tabasco, the local Maya lords hand over a peace offering to the Spanish leader, Hernán Cortés. That offering? 20 enslaved women. Among them was this teenager, Malinche, who we now know as La Malinche. When Cortés accepted this gift, he had absolutely zero idea that he'd just been handed the master key to conquering a continent. Now, what made her so uniquely, incredibly valuable was her language background. Because she was born Nahua but enslaved by the Mayans, she had this incredibly rare dual fluency. She spoke Nahuatl, which was the language of the mighty Aztec Empire, and she spoke Mayan. Now, the Spanish already had a translator who spoke Mayan, so her presence suddenly created a complete, unbroken chain of communication. And she was brilliant. She quickly picked up Spanish herself, effectively cutting out the middleman entirely, to become the indispensable link between two totally alien worlds. She became Cortés's eyes and ears.
But she wasn't just regurgitating words, you know? She was analyzing them. She provided vital cultural intelligence in a land where just one wrong step could lead the Spanish into a deadly trap. For instance, she gave Cortés the inside scoop on the deep, bitter internal divisions within the Aztec Empire. She pointed out exactly which local tribes deeply hated the Aztec Emperor Montezuma and were just itching to rebel. Without her, the Spanish are basically just blind invaders stumbling around hostile territory. But with her intel, they were transformed into a highly informed surgical strike.
Which brings us to Section 2, the bloody warning of Cholula.
This right here is where we see her first and honestly perhaps most devastating major test of loyalty. It plays out like an intense historical spy thriller. The Spanish are staying in the sacred city of Cholula as guests, but the Aztecs had secretly planned a massive ambush to just wipe them out in their sleep. Well, Malinche had befriended an elderly local woman in the city. This woman, totally assuming Malinche was just a helpless victim of the Spanish, actually warned her to flee before the massacre kicked off. But instead of running, Malinche takes the secret intel straight to Cortés. The fallout was absolutely horrific. Thousands of Cholulans were left dead in the city square after a brutal, devastating preemptive strike by the Spanish. Armed with Malinche's early warning, they completely shattered the spirit of the Aztec resistance before they even set foot in the capital. To the Aztecs, this was the exact moment she stopped being just a translator. This was when she became the ultimate betrayer.
Moving on to Section 3, Puppet Master of Tenochtitlan.
When the Spanish finally roll into the breathtaking, floating city of Tenochtitlan, Malinche's role just skyrockets. She becomes the direct physical barrier and the sole translator between the most powerful man in the Americas, Emperor Montezuma, and the conqueror, Hernán Cortés. And this perfectly illustrates how she weaponized information. Think about it. You have the traditional Spanish arsenal on one side, steel armor, devastating cannons, horses, things the Aztecs had never even seen. But then you have Malinche's arsenal, linguistics, deep cultural intelligence, and calculated psychological warfare. Her words were honestly more lethal than any cannon fire because she could exploit the specific, deeply ingrained weaknesses of an entire civilization.
Let's actually break down what that psychological warfare looked like in practice. She knew the Aztecs had these deep religious fears that the Spanish might actually be returning gods, and she deliberately leaned into that to keep the resistance totally off balance. She also intimately understood the incredibly rigid Aztec court etiquette, which let Cortés navigate their complex political landscape without a hitch. And get this,
Whenever Aztec nobles tried to quietly organize secret uprisings, Malinche used a shadow network of indigenous female informants. They brought the news straight back to her, thwarting every single attempt at resistance before it could even start.
Through her carefully crafted and strategically translated words, Emperor Montezuma was basically lured right into a trap, ultimately becoming a hostage inside his very own palace. Cortés was able to manipulate the emperor like a puppet, with Malinche literally pulling the linguistic strings. This dynamic led directly to the brutal fall of Tenochtitlan in a sea of fire and blood. When the smoke finally cleared, this former slave was standing on the ruins as the absolute most powerful woman in a radically transformed world.
Which leaves us with Section 4, the legacy of Malinche's Mo.
So, how does modern history actually remember the woman who stood on the ashes of the Aztec Empire? Well, 25. That is approximately the age at which La Malinche died. Her life was so incredibly brief, yet the sheer scale of her impact is almost hard to wrap your head around. In just a quarter of a century, she lived through slavery, rose to unprecedented political power, and left behind a permanently transformed continent, all because of the specific secrets she chose to keep and the ones she chose to share.
And her monumental historical footprint goes even deeper. After the conquest, Malinche actually gave birth to Cortés's son, a boy named Martín. Historically, Martín is considered the first mestizo, the first mixed-race child of the New Mexico. That fact alone forever intertwines her personal legacy with the literal birth and bloodline of modern Mexico. She physically bridged the indigenous and European worlds in human form.
But, as you might guess, history has not been kind to her memory. In modern Mexico, there's a deeply ingrained cultural concept called malinchismo. Let me tell you, if someone calls you a malinchista, it is definitely not a compliment. It's a highly derogatory term used to describe someone who prefers foreign things over their own culture. It is literally synonymous with betrayal. She's widely viewed as a sellout, a woman who completely abandoned her race for a seat beside the foreign conquerors.
So this ongoing debate essentially boils down to two entirely opposing views. On one hand, you have the ultimate traitor, the villainous backstabber who threw her own people under the bus for power and survival. But on the flip side, you have the enslaved survivor. Remember how her story started? She was sold into slavery by her own family. She was treated as literal property. We really have to ask objectively, did she owe any loyalty whatsoever to an empire that allowed her to be traded like livestock? From this angle, the Spanish weren't invaders. They were simply her only path of escape.
And that brings us to a final thought to wrap up this explainer. In history, the most dangerous weapon isn't always a sword. Sometimes it's intelligence, language, and just the sheer, raw will to live. So, considering her devastating use of espionage and translation, in a vicious war of survival where trust was a luxury she simply couldn't afford, was she a traitor who deserves the infamy, or simply a brilliant survivor doing exactly what she had to do?